Today, we're digging into an editorial from The Hindu that makes a really powerful claim that the recent U.S. brokered ceasefire in Gaza is, in their words, meaningless. So we're going to unpack that argument and explore what exactly makes a truce more than just an idea on paper. So this is the big question, right? The editorial really gets into this idea that you can have a truce in name, but in reality, it's totally hollow. So how does an agreement that's supposed to stop the fighting end up being called meaningless? Let's get into their analysis. The core of the problem, according to this piece, is this massive gap between the agreement itself and what's actually happening on the ground. It's a ceasefire in name, but not really in practice. So let's just quickly remember what a ceasefire is supposed to be. It's a pause, right? A suspension of fighting. It's meant to create some breathing room for talks, for de-escalation, for humanitarian aid. That's the goal. But the editorial argues that what we're seeing in Gaza is a whole world away from that. And there it is. This is the editorial's central claim. And they don't mince words. It's a pretty direct accusation, saying the whole spirit of the agreement is being ignored by the Israeli Prime Minister. So you have to ask, what evidence are they using to back this up? The argument here is that this isn't some kind of mutual, respected pause in the fighting. Instead, the claim is that the ceasefire is being used more like a tactical tool, something you can just turn on and off whenever it helps your military goals, instead of a real commitment to actually stopping the violence. Okay, so to really understand this argument, we've got to look at the sequence of events. The editorial lays out a pretty specific timeline that shows just how quickly everything fell apart. So, the ceasefire kicks off on October 10th, but it only takes about 3 weeks before things start to go sideways. Israel accuses Hamas of a violation. Then there's a reported attack on Israeli soldiers, something Hamas denies. The response? It was immediate and pretty devastating, a night of retaliatory strikes. And this number 104, this is what the editorial says was the human cost of those overnight strikes. It reports that 104 Palestinians were killed, and that figure apparently includes 46 children and 20 women. And here's the point the editorial really hammers home. Right after this massive assault, Israel just announced that the ceasefire was back on. So the source is basically asking, what kind of ceasefire is it where one side can launch these huge attacks and then just declare that the truce is still active? So we've seen what happened, but the editorial digs deeper into the why. It points to this messy mix of political ambitions, the military reality on the ground, and just a total lack of any real enforcement. They really boil it down to 3 key things. First, there's no credible way to enforce the truce. Second, you have Israeli troops still controlling a huge chunk of Gaza. And third, the political goals of everyone involved are just completely at odds with each other. Let's look at each one. This really lays out the conflicting motives. The editorial claims that the far-right partners in Prime Minister Netanyahu's coalition actively want the war to keep going. On the other side, you have Hamas, which, facing intense bombardments, agreed to the ceasefire because they just needed a break. I mean, those goals are just not compatible for any kind of real, lasting peace. Now let's talk about the situation on the ground, as the source describes it. Israeli troops are in control of more than half of Gaza. And the editorial's point is that it's just not realistic to expect Palestinians to just quietly accept an ongoing military presence like that. It says it creates this constant state of tension that's bound to boil over. And this brings us to that big diplomatic problem we mentioned: no enforcement. The next step in the U.S. plan is for Hamas to disarm. But as the editorial points out, that's a condition Hamas has never agreed to. So, with no agreement on the very next step and no one to enforce the current one, the whole thing is just incredibly fragile. So after laying out all the problems, the editorial doesn't just stop there. It actually shifts gears and proposes what it sees as a real path forward, what it would take to build a peace that's actually credible and might just last. And here is the blueprint they lay out. Step 1, a complete withdrawal of Israeli troops from Gaza. Step 2, a new Palestinian administration needs to be put in charge of the territory. And Step 3, the entire international focus has to shift away from the conflict and towards humanitarian aid, things like recovery, resettlement, and reconstruction. And this is really the bottom line for the editorial. The most urgent need is humanitarian. It argues that the only way to break this cycle of violence is by actually addressing the desperate conditions on the ground and rebuilding, not by just continuing the conflict under the illusion of a fragile truce.
And that brings us right back to our opening question, but maybe with a bit more clarity now. The editorial leaves us with this final thought to chew on. If you don't fix the underlying issues, the occupation, the political divisions, the military control, is any ceasefire just doomed to be a temporary pause before the fighting starts all over again?